Over the past decade, I've been studying the emergence of digital media platforms. Today, I want to focus on how these platforms have transformed advertising and marketing. They supercharge consumer participation, the collection and use of data, and the capacity to respond to consumers in real time. They've also made advertising and marketing uniquely impervious to public scrutiny, and this should concern us all. Digital media platforms are now significant institutional actors in the marketing of alcohol. Facebook, Instagram and YouTube are among the largest advertiser-funded media companies in the world, accounting for over 50% of spending on digital advertising. They are much more than companies that sell targeted display advertising that consumers are exposed to. They really operate as multi-sided market infrastructure that orchestrate and optimize relationships between consumers, businesses and platforms. In the case of alcohol marketing, platforms combine the sale of advertising with a range of marketing services, including data analytics, retail and distribution plugins, and tools for managing partnerships with consumers and cultural intermediaries like influencers. Rather than focus on the self-regulatory frameworks and tools of these platforms, the alcohol industry and some governments, and their effectiveness, I instead want to focus today on suggesting that we should think carefully about the kind of marketing that is emerging here. How does it work? How does it cause harm? How does it challenge approaches to governance that are founded on the principle of public scrutiny? These are the questions that we need to answer before we can move toward regulating it. Alcohol marketers matter to the larger story of the development of social media and its participatory, data-driven marketing model because they were there from the get-go. Alcohol marketers were experimenting with how to use social media to embed their brands within the everyday cultures of young people, even before the platforms really had a formal paid advertising model. As far back as 2012, Facebook and Diageo announced a collaboration to maximize consumer participation at scale in our campaigns, particularly in emerging markets. 8 years on, this announcement is telling. First, we don't see major platforms and major global alcohol distributors making these kinds of feverish and excited public statements about their partnerships anymore, even though we know they have deepened and become more sophisticated. They've learned the lessons of avoiding public scrutiny. Second, announcements like these were the first indication that alcohol marketing on platforms was much more than buying targeted advertising or fostering user-generated content. Instead, alcohol marketers and platforms were forming deep consultancy-type arrangements where they shared personnel, expertise, and, crucially, data. Instead of the marketer just buying ad space from the platform, they'd enter into a deeper collaboration. Facebook account managers would embed expertise within the marketer's organisation and vice versa. These arrangements have gained a lot of attention in the election campaigning of the post-Trump era, but the alcohol marketers were doing it first. These arrangements were not just beneficial for the marketers, perhaps even more importantly, they helped the platforms refine their advertising models. Think about tools like custom audiences or lookalike audiences. These tools could only be developed by collaborating with major global alcohol marketers who shared large data sets with Facebook. In the case of custom audiences, Facebook developed data matching tools that would take the database of consumer information that marketers held and use it to find those customers within the Facebook platform. Lookalike audiences are even more sophisticated. They take an existing audience, provided by marketers or built within Facebook, and then they use it as a query to generate a larger lookalike set of consumers on the platform. The marketer, in a sense, says, "Here are my high-value consumers. Can you find me more people who look like this?" This is a highly prospective tool, finding audiences that share things in common that perhaps a marketer didn't know until they were joined up with all the information that Facebook also held about their audience. These tools are arguably uniquely harmful for addictive commodities like alcohol, where their algorithmic architecture easily learns unintended proxies for excessive or harmful consumption, classifying dependent drinkers as high-value consumers due to patterns they share in common that might not be directly related to their expressed preferences for alcohol. What might those patterns be? It could be locative information that places them proximate to licensed venues or retailers more often than other consumers. It could be keywords used in their private messenger chats that indicate a preference for drinking or drinking-related pastimes. I want to tell the story of alcohol marketers and digital platforms as a kind of history in overdrive, and this is somewhat speculative. I'm going to split the last decade into several eras and use each to explore what alcohol marketers have been up to and how the marketing model has matured. The point here is to partly show the scale and pace of innovation, and in doing so, indicate that whatever we're looking at and whatever we think is causing harms now, and however we think we might regulate what is happening now, we need to think about where we're going to be in 2 years' time or in 5 years' time. The upshot of my argument will go something like this. Reducing the harms caused by marketing alcohol on digital platforms needs to be aimed at the infrastructure of the platform, not the content of the ads on the platform or the current tactics used by marketers on the platform. This is partly a story about alcohol marketers having lots of money to spend as a fast-moving consumer good, but it's also a story about alcohol marketers arguably looking to expand into a frontier that was unregulated, especially as broadcast and other above-the-line channels started to get more regulated. During the organic age, brands began trying to figure out what consumers' everyday drinking cultures look like, and then attempted to make themselves part of them online. For example, in Australia we saw brands making content that anticipated the Friday afternoon knockoff. Here's the Bundy Bear, the mascot of the famous Australian rum brand Bundaberg. The Bundy Bear would post images on a Friday afternoon about how he was, to use the Australian slang, fangin' for a rum. The image was posted at 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, and he's hanging out for 5 p.m. when he can knock off work and have his first rum of the weekend. This image is timed and targeted to hit the feeds of fans of Bundaberg rum on a Friday afternoon when they too are getting ready to have a knockoff drink. Those fans like, share and comment on the post as a way of communicating with peers about their own drinking culture. And as they do so, they circulate the post within their own social networks. In a sense, users are doing the targeting for the brand as they selectively pick up the brand's message and put it into circulation. They also generate more and more data about what kinds of consumers engage with the brand, and that data is then used to train and refine targeting models. In this example, we see the bourbon brand Jim Beam post an image of a tumbler of bourbon with the caption, "Soup of the Day." Fans respond to the image with comments like, "Give me some soup," and "I'm going on the Jim Beam soup diet." Here we see a crucial feature of organic reach. Brands get consumers to say things that the brand itself cannot say. In this case, consumers directly link the brand to celebrations of excessive consumption, something that brands cannot do under their own self-regulatory codes. This was an era when moderation of content was patchy. Brands above the line pages are now highly moderated, but this kind of participatory culture most likely persists now below the line, and tracking it is far more difficult. At least one of the reasons we don't see this engagement is because organic reach is now far less important within the economy of social media platforms. If brands want engagement, they now have to pay for it. As we move from the organic to the affinity moment, brands are still posting content to generate engagement with consumers, but the platform's recommendation algorithms have a big influence over what gets seen. Brands can post really all they like, but their content is only going to be recommended and shown to consumers if the platform algorithms discern a high degree of affinity with the brand. Affinity is operationalized as shared friends, connections, preferences, and interests. Brands began to go out and find consumers in real-world cultural spaces where alcohol consumption is embedded. They'd use these spaces as opportunities to produce content that wove the brand into the images that consumers circulated about their own experience of music festivals, sporting events, venues, nightlife precincts. Consumers already have a high degree of affinity with their peers, and so brands were looking for ways to tap into and make visible those networks. On screen here, we can see a typical example of this affinity era branding. This is a 100-year-old antique sailing ship placed in the middle of a large music festival by Strongbow Cider. Affluent, young and hip consumers party on the deck of the ship enjoying the festival atmosphere. The brand would encourage them to take photos of each other and post them into their own social media networks. As they did so, they would incorporate the ship and the brand into the story they were telling about themselves and their enjoyment at the festival. And they were also registering data that connected them together with the brand, particular cultural settings and their peers. During this period, we also see the rise of a particular kind of promotional worker, the promoter or nightlife photographer. Their job was to go to cultural events and nightlife precincts to photograph hot and hip consumers and post images through social media channels. The aim was to generate native engagement with brands or nightlife venues. Promoters and photographers were acutely aware of how to game the affinity of recommendation algorithms. In this slide, we see one promoter describe how he shamelessly deletes images of ugly people and doesn't post them to social media accounts for the venues he works for. He focuses mostly on taking photos of hot young women. He does this because he's learned that photos of hot people get more likes, which makes the images more visible in other consumers' news feeds, which translates into more engagement for the brand or the venue that he's working for.
Brands also move below the line by working with influencers. Influencers are contracted to create a series of images and video that incorporate the brand. In this campaign for Furphy Beer in Australia, the surfer Mitch Cox posted a series of images drinking beer while on a camping trip. The form of disclosure of the commercial arrangement is pretty oblique, and in this case, the industry self-regulator found it in breach of the code because the influencers were under 25 and were posting content without using age gating controls. This content is very difficult to track.
During the organic and affinity periods then, we see brands, venues and promoters learn to exploit the algorithmic architecture of platforms. The challenge for platforms was to shift an organic and earned model into a paid one. The time had come to make sure that brands always paid for engagement that they generated on platforms. A native, participatory and data-driven advertising model was beginning to mature. It enabled brands to have a much more formalised relationship with influencers, better access to analytics, an expanding array of features including ephemeral video stories, augmented reality filters, and buy buttons that would enable consumers to purchase alcohol directly through social media apps. Instagram's ephemeral video stories are also a crucial format here. Brands use stories posted from their own accounts of nightlife venues, sponsored music or sports festivals, and influencers. The stories are dark and ephemeral. This means they're only visible to consumers who have been targeted, and there's no public archive of them. The stories incorporate an expanding array of swipe-up features. In this one, I swipe up a story from Guinness and am taken to an interactive map where I can find the nearest pint. In this one, I swipe up and can buy wine from a hip wine delivery service, or in this one, I can swipe up and buy a bottle of engraved Patron tequila. On Snapchat and Instagram, we're seeing the rise of augmented reality advertising. Users are not targeted with ads, but rather they're targeted with ad-making tasks. The filter is an invitation to take a tool provided by the brand and make an image or a video that is then shared with peers. The content that is made is only seen by people's peers. The story then is one of constant experimentation, and that experimentation is largely happening out of sight. It's ephemeral, dark and dispersed. There's no archive of what marketers are doing, and we don't really know what is being made or who is seeing it. In response to demands for more accountability, we are seeing some tools emerge that provide a limited account of what is happening. Here's some images from the Facebook ad library. This tool was created in response to the fallout about dark ads during the 2016 presidential election in the United States. The tool offers an extremely rudimentary portrait of what is happening on the platform, but even so, it enables us to take a peek at the larger logic. These images are from the Australian alcohol retail chain, BWS. The ads are for their home delivery service. You click through Facebook or Instagram to have alcohol delivered to your door almost immediately. Each ad here features a Shop Now button integrated into the app, and the same template is used with different alcohol products inserted. Facebook's ad library explains that these ads use dynamic creative, a process where advertisers upload multiple image and text options, and the best performing combination for the audience is automatically created. The variations are only limited by the range of products the retailer sells. The retailer and Facebook's databases work together to target particular products to particular consumers at particular moments based on a combination of purchase history, preferences and so on. The young mum sees an ad for wine just after she gets the kids to bed. The young man sees an ad for ready-to-drink bourbon and cola on a Friday afternoon, and so on. Here's an example of a software developer who's created a bot to help people moderate their drinking. The developer has used Facebook's Messenger to chat to users about their experience while testing the app. The developer realised quickly, though, that by talking to drinkers through the Messenger platform, it learned their preferences for alcohol, even though their preference was to reduce their alcohol consumption. The next day, they saw many ads for alcohol brands in their Instagram feed. In Australia last year, the ABC's Background Briefing reported on a dependent drinker who was continuously tagged with alcohol as a consumption preference and repeatedly targeted for low-cost alcohol and home delivery. These forms of targeting are powerful, harmful, and not open to public scrutiny. The final era is the one that we're moving into. I call it the operational era. Let me explain by describing some research I've been doing with colleagues across media studies and computer science here in Australia. Over the past decade, we've generated vast databases of images of our everyday life, including of our drinking culture. At the same time, platforms have been racing to deepen their use of data to train their algorithmic models of recommendation and ad targeting. A key frontier is getting beyond metadata, likes, location, shares, and text, the words we type, to the images and the videos that we create. These are incredibly rich portraits of who we are, who we hang out with, and what we consume. As social media becomes much more visual, we were interested in just how classifiable our images are becoming. So we've been experimenting with building a deep neural network that does supervised and unsupervised classification of images posted to Instagram from cultural events that involve alcohol consumption. Here are some examples. This one is a supervised image classification. Supervised means the algorithm is trained in advance to classify specific objects. In this image, the coloured masks indicate the objects the algorithm has identified and the confidence score that the classification is accurate. You can see here the algorithm has identified people, but crucially, it's also identified bottles, cans, and wine glasses. Our drinking culture is becoming super classifiable to the machine vision architecture of social media platforms. Now, here's an example of unsupervised classification. This is different to supervised classification in that the machine vision system is not trained to identify specific features, but rather to look for latent patterns in a collection of images. It then clusters together images that it thinks are visually similar. Here is a cluster that features exclusively images of female gendered festival goers standing on gravel tracks in a campground holding a red plastic cup. This is an incredibly specific moment of alcohol consumption, but without much training, this machine vision system can find all these images of this moment at a 3-day music festival. We can begin to join the dots here. As we post images of our drinking culture, we are training machines to classify and cluster it, to find particular moments that those machines can then operate on. All the young women who post images like this from the campground are just documenting their enjoyment at the festival. But they're also increasingly alerting the platform to the features of their drinking culture and the drinking culture of their peers, and in a commercial platform, making it available to marketers. Here's an example of that. This is a cluster where the unsupervised machine vision system finds every image of consumers at the festival sitting on a Smirnoff branded swing in a Smirnoff branded bar. Smirnoff's sponsorship buys them access to the festival site where they engage with consumers, getting them to incorporate the brand into the images that they produce and share. But we can also see clearly here how this doubles as a data generation activity. In the present model, this would enable increasingly fine-grained targeting of promotional messages. Machine vision algorithms can be used to target consumers and build lookalike audiences based on the content of the images, the brand logos they contain, the poses that users strike, or objects like wine glasses or beer cans. But we should also be starting to think forwards to what a generative version of this might look like. As platforms and marketers use the vast data sets of social media and machine vision systems to understand our drinking culture, they are likely then to begin simulating it. A brand might be able to create totally fabricated images of drinking culture with their brand logo seamlessly embedded and then target into the feeds of a surrounding cultural event. We've already seen early indications of this in the rise of virtual CGI influencers like Lil Miquela and their partnerships with major corporate brands. Participatory culture is now doing the work of training machines to classify and cluster our culture, and that is being done on platforms that are engineered within the interests of marketers. My takeaway is this. I think we're now dealing with a form of advertising and marketing that's different. One way of thinking about this is to propose that it feels like marketing is getting more powerful, but that isn't because the messages that marketers make are somehow becoming more symbolically persuasive. Rather, the infrastructure of marketing and its techniques have changed, and that's what we need to get to grips with. We need to reimagine media as technologies for organising markets, and that means getting beyond thinking only about regulating content, placement, volume, and exposure. We cannot regulate the data-driven, participatory, engagement-oriented mode of marketing on platforms by specifying rules about content. The logic of the engagement paradigm is that we need to regulate how people are tracked, targeted, and increasingly operated upon. We need to regulate how platforms interact with consumers rather than the messages that they expose them to. This is particularly important in an era when alcohol marketers appear to have grown savvy to the exposure-based regulatory codes. As a first step, we need to find ways to insist on the publicness of marketing. Alcohol marketing affects the quality of our public life, and it simply must be available to public scrutiny.